And maybe I'll just tell you a little bit how I came to write this myth number 7, which is actually the myth that the book grew out of. In May of 2006, when the immigrants' rights movement was really coming into the national spotlight, and there were large demonstrations organized for May 1st, and there was kind of a buzz going around where people were talking about this. There was a big demonstration here in Salem. A lot of students didn't go to school that day, immigrant students. A lot of the Dominican stores were closed that day, sort of an immigrant rights moratorium day, May 1st, 2006. And I got to listen to a lot of people talking about these issues. And in my department office at Salem State, History Department office, I was making some photocopies and listening to a conversation amongst a group of white students who are fairly typical of many of the white students at Salem State, and I've had these conversations in my class time and time again. And one of them said something like, well, you know, our ancestors came here legally. I don't see why people have to come here illegally today. I'm not against immigration, I'm just against illegal immigration. Why don't they do it legally like our ancestors did? They should follow the rules like our ancestors did. And I thought, you know, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. But I also thought, I'm not going to get involved here. But then I went home and opened the Salem News, and there was an almost identical quote of a man from Peabody. Didn't specify his race, but I could guess that he was a white guy from Peabody, saying almost exactly the same thing. My ancestors came here legally. I don't see why these people have to come here illegally. And some of you may be thinking, well, what is wrong with that? I'm going to tell you. But I was so frustrated with it that I sat down and banged out a letter to the editor, which I sent to the Salem News, and it was published, and it started to kind of circulate on the internet, and somebody sent a copy to an editor at Beacon Press, and they called me a couple days later and said, we want you to write a book on immigration for us. Somebody has to say these things that you're saying. So myth number 7, the rules apply to everyone, so new immigrants need to follow them, just as immigrants did in the past. Comes from that letter to the editor that I wrote in May of 2006. One of the most oft repeated and most puzzling comments regarding the debate on immigration goes something like this. I'm not against immigration, but I'm against illegal immigration. New immigrants should play by the rules, just like our parents and forebears did. The sentiment reveals a lot about how we've been taught to think about U.S. history. We've been taught to think of this country as a country of white, voluntary immigrants. The history of people who don't fall into that category is incidental rather than central to the story we learn in school. The rules that people refer to when they say follow the rules were different for Europeans than for Africans, Asians, and Native Americans. For the latter, the rules meant enslavement, exclusion, and conquest. What the people generally of European origin who point to the rules ignore, moreover, is that when their parents and grandparents came to the United States, they in fact did exactly what the so-called illegal immigrants are doing today. They decided to make the journey, and they made it. All they had to do was get together the boat fare. The rules were different then. U.S. law explicitly limited citizenship and naturalization to white people. Non-whites were denied both entry and citizenship. Through a complex process of omission and commission, the law dictated open immigration for white people and no immigration for people of color. Immigration and naturalization law created, in the words of Aristide Zolberg, a nation by design. Between 1880 and World War I, about 25 million Europeans immigrated to the United States. They did not have visas or passports. A very small number of them, about 1%, were turned back at Ellis Island because they were deemed to be criminals, prostitutes, diseased, anarchists, or paupers. There were no illegal immigrants from Europe because there was no law making immigration illegal for Europeans. It wasn't until 1924 that numerical restrictions were placed on white European immigrants, and a system of visas and passports was instituted so that you had to actually get permission to come before you came. Creating a situation in some ways similar to today's, in which would-be immigrants had to compete before they left home for the few available visas to come to the United States. The restrictions placed on Europeans, though, pale in the face of those that the 1924 legislation placed on non-Europeans as, quote, aliens ineligible to citizenship, which is how the law defined non-Europeans, because they belonged to the colored races, again in quotes, they were excluded altogether. Although the 1924 quotas did not apply to the Western Hemisphere, Congress couldn't figure out what race Mexicans actually belonged to, since there weren't enough races. The legislation also invented the concept of the illegal immigrant and created the Border Patrol to keep Mexicans out. The last major immigration reform in 1965 finally removed the racially defined quota system and replaced it with a uniform quota system for all countries. And the uniform quota system for all countries, instead of like the 1924 legislation said some countries yes, some countries no, some countries lots of people, some countries few people, and basically privileged Northern Europeans, second were Southern Europeans, and completely left out was the whole rest of the world, just not allowed, period. The 1965 legislation created what, in a certain way, appears to be an equal distribution, that is 20,000 per country. What makes that unequal is that there are some countries that are very large, like China and India, and some countries that are very tiny, like Belgium and Oman. So if you're a person from a tiny country, especially a tiny European country, you basically have open immigration. You just have to ask for a visa and you get it. If you're a person from a large country, especially a country from which a lot of people want to go to the United States for some reasons that I'll talk about in a minute, you basically can't get a visa no matter what you do. That is, you're pretty much barred just as much as the Chinese were barred in 1882. There's no way you can come here legally. So to say that today's immigrants should follow the rules like immigrants in the past did implies that there's a single set of rules that has always been in place and that has applied equally to everybody, when in fact the rules have always been discriminatory, unfair, privileged some people over others, and they continue to do that today. The new laws of 1965 were only one factor leading to the huge increase in immigration from Latin America and Asia. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic causes of immigration here. Even more important has been the acceleration of what we now call globalization. Today's globalization builds on structures developed during centuries of colonialism that preceded it. One aspect of globalization in the second half of the 20th century has been a huge population movement from the former colonies into the lands of their former colonial masters. In order to comprehend this global phenomenon, we have to look at the socioeconomic and cultural legacy of colonialism. So the pattern we have in the United States of immigrants from parts of Asia and Latin America, where the United States has a long history of political, military, and economic intervention, isn't unique to the United States. The same thing is happening in European countries that have long histories of political, military, and economic intervention. The result of colonialism is immigration. People from India and Pakistan go to England. People from Algeria go to France. And people from the countries where the US has been involved come to the United States. In broad strokes, the European colonialism that shaped the modern world could be described as the conquest of people of color by white people, the massive transfer of natural resources out of the colonies and into the colonial powers, and the dispossession of formerly self-sufficient native inhabitants as their lands were taken for export, for the export economy, especially mining and agriculture. Modern colonialism began with the Spanish and Portuguese expansion in the 1400s, followed by Northern European expansion in the 1600s and 1700s. By the end of the 1800s, European countries had carved up much of Africa and Asia, while the United States was extending direct and indirect rule into the newly independent countries of Latin America. Formerly self-sufficient natives of these lands conveniently served as a cheaper coerced labor force to exploit the resources, land, and minerals. The colonial powers received the raw materials and agricultural products that allowed them to industrialize. The colonies were left with depleted lands and political structures that were geared toward tyranny and exploitation. If the dispossessed masses rebelled, colonial armies were quickly mobilized to repress them. Consider the example of the Dominican Republic. And I was thinking about the Dominican Republic in particular because that's the part of the world that sent the largest number of immigrants to Salem. Also large numbers elsewhere in the United States, but particularly here. It was first colonized by Spain, then by the United States. The U.S. invaded and occupied the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924, and again in 1965. Many people in the United States don't know that. Somehow in the Dominican Republic, everyone knows that. The first U.S. occupation brought about massive dispossession and transfer of Dominican land into the hands of U.S.-owned sugar plantations. The second brought about the modern version of colonialism, sometimes called neocolonialism, in which the governments of poor countries are forced to create low-wage, low-tax, low-regulation environments for the benefit of U.S. corporations. The proliferation of these export processing zones there explains why so many of our clothes bear tags saying "Made in the Dominican Republic." The United States has the highest standard of living in the world, and it maintains it by using its laws, its military to enforce the extraction of resources and labor from its modern version of colonies, with little compensation for the population. It is no wonder that people from these countries want to follow their resources to the place where they are being enjoyed. Thank Patrick for bringing that up in one of my classes a couple of years ago, and I loved the concept so much. I started using it, and then I forgot to attribute it to him when I wrote the book. Most of today's immigrants come from countries where the United States has been deeply involved in the past 100 years. In addition to the Dominican Republic, they come from such countries as Mexico, the Philippines, El Salvador, Guatemala, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Given the numerical quotas and the preference system, for most would-be immigrants from the Third World, i.e. people from former colonies, i.e. people of color, there is literally no way at all to receive permission to come here. Even immediate family members who are granted priority have to wait up to 20 years to get permission. And I think we maybe saw an example of this a few weeks ago when the U.S. soldier who was captured in Iraq, Alex Jimenez, he was from Lawrence or Lowell? Lawrence. And the whole country seemed to be mobilizing in sympathy for him and his family. And then there was the little item in the news saying that his wife was in the process of being deported because she was a so-called illegal immigrant. Even though they were married and he had applied to have her naturalized, she was still an illegal immigrant. The law then is inherently discriminatory. It primarily benefits close relatives of U.S. citizens and of permanent residents. For most people who want to come to the United States, the law simply forbids it. When the law prevented blacks from sitting at lunch counter reserved for whites, black people protested the law by breaking it, sitting down where they were told they weren't allowed. On many occasions in the past, people have struggled for equality before the law by committing civil disobedience and entering an institution, a neighborhood, a city, a state, or a country that forbids their presence. Today, we think of many of those who broke the law in the past in the interest of equal rights as heroes.